Hello, friends, and welcome to the City of the Immaculata, a place where we discuss history and theology. This is a new channel, and if you'd help me out, I ask that you would hit the like button, and if you find the content helpful, consider subscribing or sharing it with others. Thank you. Today we are discussing English Christianity, a short history. This is going to be a four-part series. First, we're going to be looking at what I'm calling the Pre-Gregorian Missions from approximately the 1st century to 596. We'll be following that up with the Gregorian Missions proper, 596 to 653. Part 3 will be early to high Middle Ages, 650s to the 13th century, and then Part 4 will be the late Middle Ages, 14th to the 16th centuries. The history is going to be a general sketch up through the Middle Ages, leading to the Reformation. And especially here in the outset, the history is not going to be all that in depth. I would even call it maybe a popular level history, but part of the problem is that the sources are so scant. At a later time, I may break down some of these parts into greater detail, but for now, we're just going to give a general history. And today we begin with the Pre-Gregorian Missions, from the time of the arrival of Christianity in England through the arrival of the Papal Missions. Now, I want to be clear about my method and intent here with these lectures. In the early stages, but all throughout, the objective is not going to be a win by knockout. This is not really an apologetics, though there might be some apologetics scattered in through it. This is not my intention. The method that I use for this is that I try to take the best of all sides, from historians to theologians, accumulate the data, and help to make a case. And we interpret these data through the specific lenses of which we're coming from, and always with some kind of bias. And I'm clearly going to be presenting this narrative with the Catholic lenses, but I want to be clear that while I do not accept some of the conclusions, there is much that we as Catholics can learn from our Anglican brethren sources. As someone with over 50% English blood, I find the lack of Catholic resources online for this early period a bit perplexing, and I always have. It's not as if we, as Catholics, conceded the narrative to the Anglicans, but it is a little bit as if we've left this story alone. So, again, right from the outset, I want to be clear. I am sympathetic to some of the Anglican claims. I understand some of their concerns and the way that they are reading back into the history. And honestly, some of the best historical works that I have in my library come from Anglican sources. And like Scott Hahn once said, that the divide between Protestant and Catholics, while it may be a very deep chasm, it's not a very wide chasm in all cases. We share a very close history. And to give due to some, I stress here some Anglican historians, they can be quite friendly to the Roman narrative. At the same time, Rome has only in recent decades, I would say, probably with the release of Eamon Duffy's work, the stripping of the altars, for those of you that are familiar with that, it's really only in recent decades that Rome has in earnest began to reevaluate the standard English textbook narrative that most of us of English-speaking countries were raised on. By that, I mean what the Church of England was in the centuries leading up to the reforms. What the church looked like, what the church's history was in the early period, the Middle Age period. And this is just my humble attempt at doing that story some justice. Now, one of the things that I'm going to be doing with the method here is I will, as we go through some of the sources, I'd like to give the hagiographic sources, as well as which communions venerate the specific people we'll be discussing. So you'll see what that looks like as we go along. So what is this period? This is a period of English history, and the record here is frustratingly very scant. There's not a lot for us to pull from. And this is a challenge with early Christianity in general, is just the lack of sources that we have. And the vacuum that's left in the wake of that, all sides tend to read into what the sources tell us. They want to read into it their own specific narrative. And this again, this is, I mean, I've even seen where the Western Rite Orthodox have their own Orthodox English narrative, right? So the data can be frustrating for all of us. And Rome and Britain specifically was the edge of the world for that time. The period that we have here, the period of Roman Britain, this was a time when Julius Caesar, this is following his conquest of Gaul. For those of you that aren't familiar with that resource, I would really recommend reading Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul. And then, you have by the 1st century, Rome coming in, conquering the English Isles, at least all the way up until to the wall here. You can see the line in the map that I have here of Roman Britain. And the assumptions are coming in, very early. The assumptions of the Christian narrative coming in here very early, to the extent that things are unknown. We are going to do the justice that we can do to it here in these coming slides. Now, interestingly, we have from Tertullian and Origen, both mention England very, very early on, but many historians doubt their, I want to say they were even one-liners, where Tertullian just mentions England in passing, Origen the same. And it might have been for Flourish, where they're exaggerating the extent that Christianity had been spread. It's not really clear, and it's not really the most reliable source in terms of the information that it gives us. Now, there is also somewhat of a popular legend of Joseph of Arimathea from Scripture. Now, I'm not a fan of this specifically. This is a late attestation from the Middle Ages, and it's so far removed that I don't think that we can give it much credence, and I'm not going to give it much credence here. But this is the period that we're looking at, and this is what we're kind of up against as a challenge. Now, the very first saint that we're going to look at is Saint Aristobulus. We do not have his birth. We don't even really have his death. The only thing that we can say of any certainty is that it was the 1st century. Saint Hippolytus of Rome is the earliest hagiography that we have of Saint Aristobulus. His feast day is March 15th in the Roman calendar, March 16th in the Eastern Orthodox calendar. And there's even, I know they use a different calendar than ours, but he's even venerated by the Egyptian Copts, which is interesting. As far as hagiography goes, he's the first official saint of the British Isles that we have any concrete attestation to, as far as, Saint Hippolytus being a reliable source. Now, the Roman tradition has him listed as a martyr. I know that's not the case with the Eastern Orthodox. There's a little bit of a different hagiography that they have for him, but the Roman tradition has him listed as a martyr. And there's not much more that we can really say about him with any kind of certainty. But he is the very first saint of the British Isles. Then we have Saint Alban. Now, I want you to notice the dates here, all right? And this gets to a little bit of the challenge that we have moving forward. One, we do not know when he was born. And two, look at the spread on the dates of what we think was his death. We have 209, 251, or 304. From 209 to 304, that's a 100-year spread. So, I mean, again, keep in mind, this is England, though we don't tend to think of England this way today. At the time, England was seen as the outer edges of the world. right? So this is why the sources are looking like this, and this is some of the frustration that we are up against. Now we have from St. Vitricius, the earliest hagiography of St. Alban, which comes to us in the 4th century. St. Vitricius would have been writing about St. Alban. We have the feast day of June 20th in the Roman calendar and June 22nd in the Anglican calendar, where he's venerated in both traditions. Primary sources that we have on him are not existent, but we do have some of his legends and some of his hagiography coming to us from St. Gildas and St. Bede in later centuries. And we also have attestation that when St. Germanus was in England visiting the country, who we'll be discussing him in just a little bit here, that he went to the relics of St. Alban and venerated them. Next, we have Saints Julius and Aaron, and all that we have for them is the date of their martyrdom. This hagiography comes to us from St. Gildas and St. Bede. They have a feast day of June 20th in both the Roman and Anglican calendars, and they are also listed in the Martyrologium Romanum, the Book of Martyrs from Rome. So there's not much that we can say about these two. We do hold them in both Anglican and Catholic communions, and we have them listed in the Martyrology. Next, we're going to look at the Council of Arles, 314. Now, this was a precursor to Nicaea. It was called by Constantine, and the reason it's of interest to us, excuse me, the reason it's of interest to us here is that it shows we have English bishops with the signature of 3 bishops from England recorded in the Acta of the Council. Those would be Bishops Eborius, Restitutus, and Aldifius. Now, the fact that they are there at this council called by Constantine indicates that we already have in England in this year 314 an episcopal structure, right? We have bishops coming, and that we have brethren that are in the English world that are active within the greater fold of the continental Christianity. So it wasn't an isolated community in England, and it's of note here for those of us that are interested in some of the intricacies of the English Christianity versus continental Christianity, that the signatures in the Acta include canons where there's an agreement on Easter being on a fixed date. So we have English bishops. This is a little bit more complex than I'd like to get into in these slides, but we do have English bishops signing the Acta where they're agreeing that Easter be on a fixed date. So that's just of interest to us for those that are, we'll be talking about Celtic Christianity here in a little bit, but we do have their signatures on the Acta of that council. Now, as far as the Council of Nicaea goes, there is pious legends that there were English bishops present at the council, but as far as anything concrete goes, and as far as I know, I've looked at the sources, I couldn't find anything. Maybe if you guys are aware of something else, leave some comments for me and I'll look up what your sources are, but I couldn't find anything of any that I'd be willing to say that we could say for sure that there was English bishops at the Council of Nicaea. Next, we're looking at St. Paulidius. The birth date for him is unknown, and we have a death date of him. He dies somewhere between 457 and 461. St. Prosper of Aquitaine is where we get our hagiography from of St. Paulidius, and St. Prosper of Aquitaine, I think I have it in a later notes, would have been writing a few centuries later, but not very far out from the time that St. Paulidius would have been alive. He's venerated in Catholic, Orthodox, and Anglican communions. He's venerated in all 3 communions. St. Prosper of Aquitaine has in his hagiography that Pelagius having been ordained by Pope Celestine is sent as the first bishop to the Scoti, believing in Christ. So we have here in this early period the beginnings of the papal office in Rome being involved in sending bishops into England. This is again, this whole lecture here is pre-Gregorian missions, but there seems to be some indication that Paulidius, at least as far as the Saint Prosper hagiography comes to us, that he was involved with this, because he was also possibly a deacon to Saint Germanus, who was clearly sent by the Holy Roman See for a mission in Britain later. Now he precedes Saint Patrick to Ireland by some years, but he's banished from Ireland and he returns back to England. There is some later controversy about him and St. Patrick that I'm not going to get into here. I'm just going to stick to the more hagiographic narratives than modern controversies. But I'll just make note of that for any of you that are interested in this. Next, we're going to look at St. Germanus, 378, died somewhere between 442 and 448. The earliest hagiography that we have from him comes from Constantius of Lyon. He has a feast day, July 31st. He's venerated in Catholic, Orthodox, and Anglican communions, and he is listed in the Martyrologium Romanum. Now, he's selected by Gaulish bishops with St. Lupus to go on behalf of the papacy, as I was discussing a minute ago, and the universal church at large. And he goes as a representative of the Gaulish bishops and the papacy to challenge British clergy against their Pelagianism. We're going to discuss Pelagianism here in a minute, but St. Germanus went there. Now, it's of note that the record that we have of him in Britain, that there's attestation that he was debating the bishops there. So it's not just a papal dictate that, the Pope sends Germanus to England and lays down the law, and that's the end of it. So how do we read this as Catholics? Well, just because there's a debate doesn't vindicate any other narratives, because of the simple fact that the Pelagians by this point were already considered lost sheep. So even if the Pope had sent Germanus there to lay down the law, you're having people that are outside of the fold with the Pelagians. And this is something where in these early records, I tend to see this a lot, where just because there's discussion about something, or just because when the Pope sends somebody, that there's people that don't agree with the Pope's decisions or with the people that the Pope sends, doesn't really offer any kind of argument one way or the other. Because let's just say, for example, you have a group of bishops in Britain or in Byzantium or anywhere else, and the Pope sends some representatives there to give what is the Orthodox position, lowercase Orthodox position of Rome. And the bishops that are native to the region, let's say they don't agree with what the Pope's finding is. Well, that doesn't say anything. That says that these bishops could be defiant, that they're not in line with the greater Christianity, that they're not in line with the way that things would be. And we see this to this very day, right? Like, just because the Pope decrees something doesn't mean that people just fall in line. I mean, we're human beings. This is history. This is how things work. But it also doesn't mean that that's not what the intent of the early church was, that the Pope, with his prerogatives and his powers, does have the power to send these bishops on behalf of the greater church. So that's St. Germanus. Next, we're going to look at what are the most attested two men from the British Isles whose careers are the reason we have such a wide attestation to them, is because their careers took place outside of England. So while they were from the island, they were known principally for their work outside of the island, which is why we know them so well. And obviously here we're dealing with, if you know anything about these two men, we're dealing with two men that are on opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of their theology, but we're going to take a look at both of them here kind of quickly. First, Pelagius, 354 to 418. Now, we're not totally sure that Pelagius was from England, but it seems that he most likely was. And Pelagius, Catholics are often accused of being quote unquote Pelagian, and that's something that is a little bit beyond what we can get into here. But there's a little bit of irony to that. Pelagius himself was known for teaching strict ascetical practices for sanctification that would take part apart from grace. And he denounced what he called Roman laxity, right? Rome, as far as he was concerned, was way too forgiving. That Rome was not strict enough, and this may sound familiar for some of you leading up to this very day, right? Rome has always been a very pastoral see, and it has to be. I mean, if it is what we say it is, it's the universal see. There has to be some sense of pastoralism involved in how Rome handles things, because when you're dealing with somebody like Pelagius and he's teaching these ascetical practices, it's not that the ascetical practices were bad in of themselves, right? Like we have plenty of saints that practice ascetical practices, but it's the problem with Pelagius is his teaching about it being sanctifying outside of any use of grace whatsoever, but also his challenge to Rome, right? That Rome was not strict enough for him in its disciplines and in its ascetical practices, just sort of misses the mark, right? Well, I mean, it doesn't sort of miss it. It misses the mark by a wide margin. Now, Pelagianism and what would later be known as semi-Pelagianism was very, very entrenched in the English Isles, right? So we even have, with Saint Germanus going there and arguing with the bishops, we have some leading up in the later years, some challenges with the British Isles and how far Pelagianism had sort of sunk into it. I mean, we have Saint Patricius, where he speaks about that the island was just overrun with Pelagian bishops. So that's a little bit part of your history when it comes to the English Isles, right? So even so much in their independence from Rome, it wasn't necessarily an Orthodox accepted independence, right? We're talking about bishops that are outside of the fold that are holding to these Pelagian ideas. So that's Pelagius. Next, we have St. Patrick, and I mean, who doesn't know St. Patrick, right? I mean, we have a wide and varied hagiography of St. Patrick. Now, we have two primary sources from Patrick, which is interesting that because we don't have a lot of primary sources coming from the pens of these people in this very early period, but we have his Confessio and his Epistola. And St. Patrick, he has a feast day on March 17th in the Western calendar. I know he is allowed to be celebrated in the Eastern calendar, and I think there's even some allowance for Eastern Orthodox to, even though his date is, I don't have his date here for the Eastern Orthodox calendar, but they allow him to be celebrated on March 17th for some Orthodox. Now, he was possibly born in Britain, but he was certainly tied to it. I'm going to be doing an Irish Christian history lecture at another point, so I think I'm going to save some of the details of St. Patrick's life for that. But it's just to be noted here that he, though he is known as the apostle to the Irish, he is actually, from what all seems to point to, is actually a Briton himself. And all sides affirm Patrick's orthodoxy, and he's universally venerated as a saint in all the communions. So it should be pretty clear at this point that we're not totally free from the Roman world once you get into England. Now, that's a claim that comes up quite often in certain sources, but from Paulidius to Germanus, I mean, we have the popes dictating missions and sending men who all sides venerate as saints to go and settle disputes. Now, is that a knockout case for our side as Catholics? No. But it does, at the very least, defeat the side that would claim that the English Christianity is its own little independent system free from any Roman influence. But the question always arises, what about Celtic Christianity? And it's impossible to do this story full justice in a short presentation like this, but there are so many misconceptions about Celtic Christianity. For one, it's not a unified collective that we can identify as, quote unquote Celtic Christianity. It's a bit, it's not even a bit, it's very anachronistic reading back into history to try to find something that's uniformly Celtic Christianity. And some of the readings of it, some of the readings clearly ignore some of the very obvious Roman influences in parts of this wider thing that we call Celtic Christianity. Some unique features of it, though, is their dating of the Easter. One of the unique features is that they had a unique tonsure, right? So the monks, if you look at like a picture like this, right, the monks' tonsure on top of their head, the Celtic tonsure was different than the tonsure of the Benedictine Western monks. And they had a unique system of penances, which I'll touch upon here in a second. But I want to be clear. Personally, I appreciate Celtic Christianity as its own distinct expression of Christianity, similar to what we might find with something like Coptic Christianity or Byzantine or Roman or any other. But its distinctiveness comes, as far as the story comes to us today, primarily from British Protestants that wanted to make this sharp contrast. And they felt the need to make a un-Roman Christianity that existed in England to justify the reform of the reforms during the Reformation. And the certain Celts themselves, a challenge to this is that they're, due to the complexity of this, you can't really speak for Celtic Christianity as a whole, but there were certainly certain Celts themselves who were the ones that actually wanted to bring the Celtic Church into the greater conformity with the universal church. I mean, one of the things that we know about parts of Celtic Christianity is that they absolutely loved the Latin language. They saw the Latin language when the Mass was performed in Latin and Celtic areas. They saw it as otherworldly. And they lauded, certain Celts lauded a Latin liturgy. And their system of penance, this is a unique fact that many people don't know, but the penitential system of private confessions comes to us from Celtic Christianity, because in the wider world of Christianity, in the universal world, the practice was actually public penance. So if you could imagine this, right, you would have to go publicly and confess your sins. Well, the Celts, in their infinite wisdom, realized that maybe it's a little bit better if we actually have private confessions where you go to the priest and you confess your sins privately. And this, I mean, once the practice spread to the greater continental Christianity, people began to see the prudence of such a decision. So that's a Celtic practice that actually the wider Christian world picked up. And and what's often ignored by those first reformers that were using Celtic Christianity as propaganda is that one of the most iconic and distinct things about Celtic Christianity is its wonderful monastic life. Which again, it deserves its own lecture that I will do at a future date. But in short, we can both give credence to a distinct Celtic Christianity and at the same time have it a part of Christianity as the greater fold. So with that, we come to the end of the Roman era in Britain. Rome by the 5th century is all but gone from Britain, and we enter into a new era. So hopefully you will see this as a fair account of what we can say about this early time. The records being what they are, it's a very difficult period to assess. And going forward, we're going to be able to hone in a little bit more clearly on a very, very specific Catholic narrative with the beginning of the Gregorian missions that we're going to be looking at next time. So we're speaking specifically of Saint Gregory the Great in the missions that he began into the British world after this period of Roman Britain. So stay tuned, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Again, if you like this channel, like and subscribe, and I will see you then. Take care.